Welcome everyone back to the keynote lecture, which is about to begin, and then two more very stimulating panels. So we're very pleased to welcome as our keynote speaker Valerie Steele. In the interest of time, I'm not going to give too much detail. As for the other speakers, you have a more detailed description in the pamphlet. But Valerie Steele is Director and Chief Curator of the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where she has organized more than 25 exhibitions since 1997. And she's also authored more than 25 books, which is amazing, amazingly prolific. And I think you'll see she's noted not only for her scholarship, but for her ability to communicate about the whole fascination of the history of fashion. So without further ado, Valerie Steele.
Yeah. So, fashion is supposed to be a form of nonverbal communication, which means that you all ought to be able to read my clothing, if not the clothing of 500 years ago. So I'd like to start. Where's the microphone out there? If someone can get the microphone, or just stand up and project, I'd like you to tell me what you can tell about me by what I'm wearing, what I look like, and how I might differ from people of 500 years ago. So,
you're a New Yorker.
Because I'm wearing black, he says I'm a New Yorker. Well, it's true, New Yorkers tend to wear black, but only in some neighborhoods. I tell you, on the Upper East Side, those rich ladies don't wear black. What else? Businesswoman. Not quite. I'm an administrator, which means I'm not loved. But I'm not exactly business. I'm not raking in the money. How did you read business, though? The suit, exactly. Okay, so it reads like business. That's right. Like that Victorian cartoon where the man says, I mean business. Say it again? I took it very briefly, although I'm really a horseback riding girl, not a ballet girl. Yes?
Great sneakers, probably love shoes.
I do love shoes, I do. But whereas I used to be called the high-heeled historian, now I'm in sneakers 90% of the time. I was in the gym, this public gym for poor people, and this guy lifting 400 pounds stops and he looks at this pair of sneakers and he goes, are those Lanvin sneakers? And I said in my snobbiest voice, why yes, these are Lanvin sneakers. And he said, yeah, I like the crinkled leather version better. Put me in my place. Anything else? Yes? Comfort is a psychological state. If I were wearing my corset, would you say I was comfortable? Probably you wouldn't think so. One more thing. Anything else? Pants, that's right. Different than her. So that's one of the key gender differentials for centuries in the West, is that women have been wearing some kind of long skirt or dress, and men have been wearing some bifurcated garment, in this case tights rather than trousers. So let's see. We'll just move on a little bit. Another aspect of fashion is, in addition to gender differentiation, it is also frequently tended to highlight sexual or secondary sexual characteristics. We usually think of this in modern times as breasts and hips and bums, but of course, in the Renaissance, the codpiece highlighted the male penis. If you go from roughly 1860 to 1955, you find also that this fairly rigid sexual dimorphism in clothing. Now, if you looked at other cultures like Japan or Indonesia, or if you looked at 18th century Europe, you might not be quite so stark, because in 18th century Europe, upper-class couple might both be wearing a pink silk suit embroidered with flowers and lace. And in Indonesia, they'd both be wearing sarongs. But it wouldn't be the same. I mean, I remember in Indonesia, the foreigners kept wrapping the sarongs the wrong way for the other sex, and people would tell them, you got it all wrong. You're cross-dressing. And people are like, who cares? But it was very upsetting to the Indonesians to see people doing that. And then this kind of classic image of sort of mid-century Americana, where the different clothes also have very much to do with different roles. Goes right back to the chimpanzees. So you've got this sort of like going out and fighting in the world versus staying home with the kiddies. But notice also the very dressed up homemaker look. At that time you have books like Wife Dressing, which emphasized that you had to dress in a feminine way so your children would model correctly what women were supposed to be like. And you should never wear blue jeans at home. Even if you're cleaning the floor, you should wear a girdle so you looked appropriately feminine. So a lot of it had to do with clothing being used to condition you for appropriate role play. Obviously, there were self-conscious attempts to change that with unisex. Rudy Gernreich developed this unisex styles for men and women, particularly caftans, although most attempts at unisex have been drawing on the male vocabulary. As one lesbian put it in the 1980s, when cock is king, go for the codpiece. There's no point in copying the clothing of the weaker and more despised sex. You want to copy the clothing of the powerful sex. And in fact, it's fairly rare that men have copied things from the female wardrobe. It was really extraordinarily rare in as late as the 1970s for men to wear earrings, for example. And only gradually, particularly with sports figures doing it, did regular men get in touch with their inner pirate and take back earrings from the female wardrobe and say, no, you could wear earrings too. In general, the idea is to dress like someone who has more power. You see it with uniforms too. Police women in the United States used to have to wear a skirted suit. In many states, they also had a smaller gun, which they had to carry in a purse. They also had to wear shoes with heels and sometimes a stupid little hat. As one woman who later became a police captain in Virginia put it, you can imagine it was hard to chase the perpetrator when you were dressed like that. But the point is, you weren't supposed to. You were supposed to be doing things like helping lost children. Later on, when the federal legislation was passed mandating equal opportunities, including equal kinds of uniforms for police officers. Now, I'm going to talk about several aspects of my own research over the years, which have tended to focus on sex and gender issues in fashion. And people seem to write the same. My friend said, we all write the same book over and over again. And it intended to be this way for me. Corsets were the way I got into fashion in the first place. When I had a very checkered history. I dropped out of high school, ran away, lived in a lesbian feminist commune, never finished high school, couldn't get into Harvard, was rejected. They said, you're not Harvard material. But I ended up later on going to graduate school at Yale. And my first term at Yale, I was there studying modern European cultural history. We had to give a report on 2 scholarly articles. I don't remember what I read. I assume it was something about the French Revolution. But my classmate Judy Coffin reported on 2 articles from the feminist journal Signs, arguing about the meaning of the Victorian corset. Was it oppressive to women, or was it sexually liberating? And it was just like a light bulb went on, and I realized, fashion's part of culture. I can do fashion history. So I did, thereby destroying any opportunity of having a career in academia. But this is the image that people have of corsetry. You know, this is an 18th century caricature, but people always think of, I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard someone in a corset exhibition saying, remember Scarlett O'Hara and the 16-inch waist? This is really hardwired into everyone's memory. In fact, men sometimes wore corsets too, and you have exactly the same type of caricature for dandies. But tight lacing was really a very small part of what corsetry meant in the more than 400 years that it lasted, from about 1500 into the mid-20th century. So if you look at something like Manet's Nana, you see that part of what's going on with the corset is it's not just a waist cincher, which would emphasize what anthropologists call the waist-hip differential, much bigger in a woman than a man. The woman sort of, for a young woman, it might be 0.7. For a man, it would be 0.9. In other words, the waist 9/10 of the size. But also, it's like a brassiere. It's pushing your bust up and supporting it. And it's also an element of underwear, in this case, luxurious blue satin underwear. At this time, people thought of that kind of luxurious underwear as associated with the aristocracy of vice. Only courtesans and actresses wore that. But very soon afterwards, any fashionable women did too. These are from the mostly men's magazine, La Vie Parisienne, centerfolds before and after the corset. Improved, for example, if you were too skinny, you were padded out, which is very common. We think of corsets just squeezing people in, but padded corsets are extremely common. Corsets which in the middle, the woman's figure is supposed to be great, but her breasts are starting to sag, so you lift them up, etc. As one doctor put it in a book in the middle of the 19th century, corset is a lie, but we prefer the lie to the truth. So the idea was it was going to improve all of these flawed female bodies. And then you have another centerfold looking at different kinds of corsets. Anything from the young girl's very simple bust bodice to, you know, the one with the black corset and the blue stockings, the laundress who's thinking of going bad, to this elaborate kind of colorful satin and vulgarly trimmed corsets that cocottes would wear, corsets that were scented so they'd smell more as they got hotter. But the woman in the center has no corset. She's just wearing a silk undershirt. And they say that actually that would be best, is what they say, if you didn't have to wear a corset. Unfortunately, they say there's usually more need for one rather than less. But what's interesting is already by about the 1890s, and certainly by 1900, 1902, you see more and more photographs of women, actresses, etc., wearing corsets and in their fashions. And they interview these ladies and they say, who's your favorite couturier? Who's your favorite jeweler? Who's your favorite corsetier? And very often the women will say, I don't need to wear a corset. And you look at the photograph and you go, babe, you are so wearing a corset. But it's already started to seem that it will be better if you didn't need to wear one. The corsets are already starting to be reinterpreted, no longer as a sexy but necessary part of underwear, but as being something that only older, fatter, sagging bodies would somehow need. This business with the tight lacing comes in large part from a lot of fetishistic letters, in particular, in English magazines, like the English Women's Domestic magazine, where they retail and copy over and over all kinds of fantastical stories about tight-lacing boarding schools, which have men who are cross-dressed as girls, and Mademoiselle de Beauvoir, the sexy, sadistic French mistress, is lacing them up tighter and tighter from 15 to 14 to 13 inches. So in other words, they're mostly kind of sexual fantasies. And some of the magazines have advertisements, including those for men's corsets, which again are part of a sexual subculture of some men cross-dressing and wearing corsets, and a lot of sexual fantasies going on, and sometimes being acted out. So it's not in the boarding school, actually, but it might be in specialized brothels, where you could dress up as the schoolgirl and then have a Mademoiselle Beauvoir whip you or lace you or whatever you wanted her to do. This is from a modern-day tight lacer who I met in the course of working on my fetish book. And then this whole idea of fetish, I want to move from corsets in general to fetish, including corsets, was something that took up several interesting years of research for me. It was very funny. People were like, well, weren't you scared to go to those fetish clubs? And I went to Dartmouth. Let me tell you, those perverts were gentlemen compared to fraternity boys. So from that world of sort of the sexual underworld, the punks took corsets and they brought them back out and made them outerwear, just as they took safety pins and garbage bags and all kinds of things which were seen as being deliberately revolting and provocative. And here you see Vivienne Westwood, the first famous designer who was originally a punk. And you can see what she's doing is a kind of like an 18th century style corset, but now, of course, with plastic boning, etc. This was then picked up, especially by Madonna, with her Jean-Paul Gaultier corsets for blonde ambition. And once this happened, then corsetry stopped being just sort of a high-end or a homemade thing, and you started getting all kinds of $30 bustiers sold on East 8th Street, and underwear as outerwear became kind of a recognized theme. When I did my corset show, in addition to the history of corsets over the centuries and the history of high fashion designers using corsets, I also had lots of sort of club kid corsets, and obviously this one in the center is a fantasy corset, but most of the others were quite inexpensive, sort of rubberized corsets worn by men as often as women. And here, this is a high fashion corset by Christian Lacroix, and the model's being laced up backstage by Mr. Pearl, who was a corseteer and tight lacer. And is the only person that I've ever walked down the street with in New York where people's heads flipped around when they went to look at Mr. Pearl, because he really did have an incredibly tiny waist. And he was very disgruntled that when I took him both to FIT and to the Costume Institute at the Met, none of the corsets were as small as his own corset. So much for many historical 16, 17-inch waists. So most of us associate corsetry with bondage. And bondage and discipline there's overlap there between corsetry and fetishes in general. Overlap with S&M, also overlap with cross-dressing. And with the idea of the high heel shoe being, in a way, the sort of modern day equivalent of a corset. When you hear people anathemizing fashion, they seldom mention corsets anymore except as a historical evidence of patriarchy torturing women. But they frequently mention high heel shoes. High heels had, in the past, been worn by men too. Here you have a red man's high-heeled shoe, but rapidly became associated with women's clothing, and then became the focus of a particular sort of fetish. And then this one from Vienna, of course, 1900, where the phallic symbolism of the high heel is made rather painfully evident. That was intended to be inserted into somebody. And then you have, again, the crossover from he-male to she-male. So the idea that you're transformed by switching into a different kind of shoe. And in fact, I was once trying on shoes in a shoe store in New York at Jeffrey's, and I kicked off my loafers and put on a pair of high-heel shoes, and this man who was lurking nearby leaned over and leered, "Now yours look sexy," from changing shoes. So apparently shoes do have this sort of magical effect on some people. And then, of course, the idea, which I got very clearly reinforced from talking to dominatrixes, things like corsets and high heels are very much associated with the power dominatrix figure. And the idea that they're, if you're taking Freudian terms, that they're being endowed with all of these phallic signifiers, but also in more practical terms, as one dominatrix said, it makes you taller. And that's a power thing, like the chimpanzees. You want to be bigger. You want to be at least as tall as this guy who's paying you. And also that the corset's going to be sort of, you're viscerally hard-bodied at that point. So Freud, of course, was not right about a number of things, but he specifically said that fetishism would prevent men from becoming homosexuals. But of course, homosexual men have fetishes just as heterosexual men, and some women, although fetishizing in general seems to be more the norm for males and somewhat more unusual for women, at least in the sense that of fetishizing of having a necessary sexual state of arousal associated with the fetish. So everyone's a fetishist to some degree or another. In other words, everyone has some preferences. They might like redheads, for example, or they might like people who have big breasts, or men who are tall, or whatever. But if you have a level 2, then that's really quite a bit more important to you. Level 3, you can only really achieve orgasm with a redhead, or a tall man, or someone with big breasts. And level 4 is you don't really need the person at all. You just put on the shoes or whatever it is yourself, and the person is unimportant. So that kind of fetishizing is much commoner among men than women. So various kinds of garments can be fetishized. Anything can. I mean, an undershirt can. Underwear in general is something that's likely to be fetishized. Traditional view was because it was hiding the last moment that the woman could still be regarded as phallic, and this is from a fetish magazine. But men's underwear also quite often fetishized. The famous giant billboard above Times Square. And I was told how when this was photographed, the model was padded out in a very interesting way with Wonder Bread, that the crusts were cut off and the Wonder Bread was gently molded around his penis to give a more pronounced basket. So other kinds of second skin materials are frequently fetishized, particularly leather. Older people will recognize this from the Avengers, where this was a real fetish outfit from a fetish company where only the facial mask was taken off for the TV show. This, from the 70s, is so fascinating because it was from the Montgomery Ward fashion show. So, you think it's only going to be really out there designers like Versace who are going to do fetishy clothes. On the contrary, in the 70s, which was sort of the era of sexual liberation, you had this kind of imagery just running throughout the whole fashion culture. You definitely also had, by the 70s, a whole Leatherman culture, which had been incubating in big cities in the US in particular since the 1940s. And the Leatherman culture then had an influence on Versace's clothes. So Versace said in an interview that before he did this, his famous bondage collection, he had tried about 8 years before, and he did a show, and he said they turned the lights up on him. It wasn't a Paris, a Milan show. It was in some town, in some other town where they were doing a fashion show. He said, they turned the lights up on me, and they said, these clothes belong only in a leather bar. And he said, and now look, socialites in bondage. So I was interviewing a bunch of leather fetishists, and I said, so what do you think of the Versace collection? And they said, we hate it. And I said, why? And they said, because you can't tell whether somebody's really into something now or just making a fashion statement. But that, of course, is true of anything that's a good look. Fashion will immediately hoover it up and transform it. So this is from an exhibition that I did a few years ago, A Queer History of Fashion, From the Closet to the Catwalk. And we got a Leatherman ensemble and the Versace thing, and then various other leather looks. Leather's been an important component of fashion in general for some of the same reasons, because it has that hard body feel. It's associated with kind of tough imagery like motorcyclists. And it has that whole interesting smell and sound. Leather creaks and smells in a very interesting and visceral way. But I think one of the key things about both the corset and leather is the association with the hard body. I remember when my students used to say to me, well, why was it that women gave up wearing corsets? And I used to tease them, and I said, oh, they didn't give up wearing corsets. They just internalized it through diet and exercise and plastic surgery. The idea was that you couldn't rely anymore on whalebone or metal to push your fat around. You had to have a body that was itself a hard body. And that has been expressed in innumerable styles of fashion for women and for men, because that hard, invulnerable, robot-like body is associated with invulnerability. And then various kinds of sexual cliches in costuming. And what's most interesting is the sort of the cutoff points at neck and wrists, the idea of body parts being isolated. The corset on an evening gown from the 1950s, Jacques Fath, a very sexy evening gown. And then the idea of cross-dressing, which has appealed to many people, including some women, For quite a long time. This was, of course, Yves Saint Laurent from the 1970s, in which he said that he was directly inspired by Marlene Dietrich in Morocco. Then you've got other kinds of power suiting, though. It doesn't have to be hard or overtly sexual, like a codpiece or a hard corset. You have all the sort of status dressing. And as you said before, like the business suit, it's kind of a thing. Well, that's a symbol of status and money, among other things. Then you have the whole kind of physical beauty and strength, which in and of itself is something that you try and approximate in clothing. One of the reasons that business suits have been so popular for so long is because they camouflage all of the myriad flaws in male bodies, just the way corsets were supposed to do for female bodies. And then you have the whole idea of different separate sexual undergrounds, which would have their own specific styles where you could signal to other people that you were one of them and not one of those other straight vanilla people. So another image here, also from when I did a queer history of fashion, was the idea of Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde was very into fashion, both men's fashion as he wore it and women's fashion, editing a fashion magazine. And so this idea of his look at first was something which mixed male and female signifiers, as well as historicizing and aristocratic things like showing off the legs and knee breeches and wearing velvet, which was associated as a woman's material. This came from a book, George Clancy's Gay New York, from a 19th century guide of types you might see in New York, including on the upper side, a gay man who'd be wearing a short jacket and tight pants and might have a curly, longer hair. And then the whole idea of the dandy, which became a really important gay icon. Here, in a kind of almost butterfly dandy style with Count Robert de Montesquieu. And then here in the kind of female dandy, the very, very important early 20th century lesbian look, which again is borrowing from the male upper class wardrobe, extremely important, pivotal look in the history of lesbian fashion and also of women's fashion in general. So you saw it ubiquitously in, say, Brassai's photographs of lesbian bars in Paris. And you also saw it in images of fashionable women as that whole kind of garçon look took over as being the fashionable style. Marlene Dietrich, of course, who really was an important figure in terms not only of wearing full-scale men's dress off-screen as well as on-screen, but also pioneering wearing trousers and being a sort of bisexual icon for fashion people for generations. We got some of her clothes, which we posed next to Saint Laurent in Queer History. And then, of course, one of the key reasons why you have LGBTQ styles has been a way to signal in a hostile society so that you could meet other people who would also be queer and without cluing out people who might be straight and hostile. So those varied, but they included things like dyed hair, red ties, suede shoes, etc. Yves Saint Laurent posed here on leather cushions for his early perfume ad. And then the very much politicized gay styles of the AIDS era and beyond. And then we haven't even talked about the erotic appeal of the uniform, but is one which goes right back in history, so that both male and female brothels in 19th century Paris had a range of uniforms. So people who had a fetish for nuns or a fetish for soldiers from a particular regiment or sailors or brides could find all those costumes at the brothel. And then I'll just show you so you can see how advertising for fashion picks up on not just gender stereotypes, but also a lot of sexual stereotypes. These are a few years old, so this is no longer, obviously no longer current Balenciaga, nor current Gucci. The current Gucci ads couldn't possibly be any more different than this. Hugo Boss, that's like, same with the Hermes, that's like rich people's white clothes. And then this is probably Saint Laurent, but again, it's that sort of, it's the hipster cool rock chick look, which is ubiquitous in fashion advertising. Celine, which was for a while the sort of smart women's fashion that was not going to be all these sexual stereotypes, kind of quirky women's style. And then, although women may not be as often sexual fetishists like men, certainly commodity fetishism is running rampant throughout society. And that, as they say, is another story, but it's an incredibly important part of the fashion story as well. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Valerie, for a wonderful talk. We have time for questions. Again, please come to the center. And I know there'll be a lot of people who want to ask questions, so please ask questions, keep the questions short so that we can accommodate as many people as possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele. I was intrigued and troubled by Professor Peters' comment earlier today that sex is the naked body and gender is the clothed body. I was wondering if you wanted to either trouble or expand on that idea, in particular around the idea of gender nonconforming fashion and the way that sexuality and fetishism has been de-emphasized in new designers looking to promote a non-binary idea.
Right. Well, a lot of people hate fashion, and one of the main crimes of fashion is it's seen as being artificial, not natural. But the idea that the body itself is natural is, of course, a complete fantasy, because we structure our bodies in innumerable ways, that we're taught to stand and walk, we cut our hair, we shave, we do all kinds of things to our bodies. And really, I think, rather than pitting body versus clothing, it's more useful when you're thinking of the relationship to think of the body-clothes unit as being what you're using to convey aspects of identity. So the very same garment, say a corset, is going to convey different things on a male or a female body, and depending on what kind of body it is. Blue jeans historically were seen as being something that molded to a variety of different bodies and told sort of different stories about who you were, because the garment was such in close connection with the body. Now give me the second half of the question again about how fashion has been
sort of desexualized from designers that are promoting a gender non-conforming aesthetic, and how does that filter in with the kind of sexiness of the fetishization world?
I think that some designers have tried to de-emphasize overt sexual characteristics in clothing, but others have, in fact, stretched the idea of taking something which might be stereotypically sexy in one area and seeing what happens if you have other people wear it. So for example, pink has in the West been seen as a feminine color for quite some time. And yet over the last 10 or 15 years, it's been more and more appropriated by men and has acquired a range of other meanings. It's been associated with the LGBTQ community, and particularly with sort of queer radicals within it, who see the rainbow as being more bourgeois and pink as being a more radical queer color. It's also was picked up in a very big way by African American men, particularly coming out of the whole hip hop experience. And it took about 10 years for Caucasian men to start tiptoeing towards the kind of pink is this sort of masculine or at least androgynous color. Although you had a long history within rock and roll and earlier musical forms of pink as being a rebellious color. Now, Elvis wore pink, of course, and had a pink Cadillac, but in that way, he was actually copying probably Sugar Ray Robinson, the African-American boxer. And then later on, the bass guitarist for The Clash said how pink was the only real rock and roll color. So you can destabilize the sort of sexualization either by trying to do something which is gender neutral, which is really kind of hard to do because it's almost always going to tilt towards, I think, the male clothing vocabulary. You can get men in skirts, or caftans, but it's a harder sell. You got them in earrings, so you can get them in anything, but it's a harder sell. But also you can destabilize the symbolism of something which has been seen as feminine and sort of rebrand it. But I think very often to make it popular, you don't rebrand it as asexual, you brand it as being kind of both sexual or a range of sexual. Because really, how many people want to be sexually neutral? They want to have their own expression of their own sexuality, whatever that is. But usually, except for people who really identify as asexual, usually they do want to have some kind of a sexual appeal to other people, or to some other people. Yeah.
I have a question that I hope may resonate with some other folks in the room. So my identity, for as long as I can remember, has been around being an intellectual being. And so this idea that I give time to think about how I present myself was antithetical. And so it's only very recently that, I got a real job and had money to spend on fashion that I've started to think maybe this is a variable in my life that I can play with. Do you have any advice? Again, other people in this room are also at Harvard, right? Harvard has a very particular style. Yeah. I was educated at MIT, very different style there, right? We're professional folks. We also have private lives, and I'm just curious about your thoughts about being intellectuals who also care about how we dress.
Yeah, this is something that I have experienced from the very beginning of my career. Fashion is despised widely in American society, but it is especially despised within American academia. I wrote an article once called The F Word, which was in Lingua Franca, the academic journal. And I literally could not get any academic colleagues to go on record with their name to say anything about fashion because they didn't want to be associated with it at all. Even people who I knew were quite interested in fashion. Because the idea is that the life of the mind means that the life of the body is immaterial, especially when it's not even the body, but it's like this flayed extra skin, this low bourgeois, anti-feminist, consumerist, conformist thing that somehow you have to put on your body, but we intellectuals don't follow any style. And to some extent, that's true. I mean, I would say academics are probably the worst dressed middle-class occupational group in America. But nevertheless, they are buying their own clothes. In only a handful of instances are their mothers still buying their clothes. And therefore, it behooves them to take some responsibility for their clothes and decide what makes them happy to wear. And I think that's really the answer. The person who said, you look comfortable in what you wear. Basically, especially now, there are very few social rules, even in a job situation, about what you have to wear. So you might as well try and figure out what makes you happy to wear it, because otherwise you can just outsource it to mom, but she'll pay for it. But apart from that, there's probably a downside to that as well, because it does sort of convey something about who you are and what you think you are, and that you do, in fact, think about who you are, which is not a bad thing to do, even for a brainiac.
Hi. So you mentioned when you were talking about the corset that there's a lot of interactions between women wanting to borrow from a masculine style that is either of a higher class or of a gender association that has more power. Yeah. I actually took a really brilliant class at school at Harvard, taught by Professor Jonathan Square on fashion and slavery. Yep. And I was wondering if you could talk more about how you see the sort of interaction. You mentioned Gucci is really changing the way that it presents itself, and a lot of that has to do with streetwear. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how streetwear is becoming to be so powerful in fashion, and how design houses have historically borrowed from marginalized populations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The standard old sort of 19th century Veblen-esque thing is that, the fashions are set up high and they trickle down, and that middle-class people imitate upper-class people. However, very often, and even at least as early as the 18th century, and probably earlier, although my own studies don't go really before the 18th century, you found elite people borrowing from working-class dress, and sometimes even borrowing cross-culturally, so that in 18th century London, There were upper class men who were wearing styles of coats, which were like the kind of thing that coachmen wore, and definitely sort of affecting a kind of rough working class demeanor. And then you also had some who were cutting their hair like mohawk haircuts, I mean, sort of centuries before the punks. So you had this kind of appropriation. Frequently, I think it has to do with a very widespread fantasy that working class men or men of other ethnicities are more masculine and more virile, and that you can get that if you can assimilate some aspect of their appearance. And then there's also all kinds of, sort of middle-class leftists who again saw working class men as being not only probably more virile, but also more sort of authentic and real. So you get that whole kind of fantasy it's really kind of a variant of the fantasy of the natural man, or even sort of the natural savage, that you're going down there and you're finding somebody who's authentic, and you're trying to get that authenticity. So you often will find, you found that in the 60s all the time, with the idea that blue jeans or certain kinds of ethnic clothing were more authentic than bourgeois fashion. So there are many, many occasions when people have appropriated styles of dress, hairstyle, tattooing. I mean, think of all the endless styles, everything from Japanese to Maori tattoos to Dayak tattoos that people have appropriated. Although nobody actually yet is talking about tattoo cultural appropriation, but as with fashion, it's there too. And there's usually a sense that there's something more desirable, more authentic in that culture than in your own culture. And of course, the fashion industry has been doing this for a very long time, but especially since the 1960s, the idea that you're copying streetwear and also you're copying active sportswear. So there are huge numbers of young people today who I think have never worn a pair of leather shoes because they've only worn sneakers. So that kind of thing becomes, it's again an association with a cool factor. Who's wearing it? They're younger, maybe they're hipper, they seem more knowledgeable, more cool than just sort of sheltered middle-class kids, and so you want to look like that. You never underestimate the desire to look like somebody that's cooler than you, however that's defined.
Okay, final question?
So this kind of follows on from that. One thing that struck me about the two caricatures that you showed us of the corset, like the tight lacing, was that in both of those caricatures, we had one of the people doing the lacing was a black man or a black boy. And so I was wondering whether that was a coincidence or whether there's something going on there about either class. Yeah, the first one there is. Yeah, right at the back. And I thought both of them, yeah.
Let me see if I can go back or
so
go
I was
forward.
just wondering, if that's something you've seen before, what do you think is going on there? Is it simply a coincidence? Or?
Can you help me get back to the first? Anyone can help me get back to this corset one. Certainly I noticed it with the dandy one, the second one, and that has to do, they're both English caricatures, and I think they have to do very much with the idea of servants. Those are servants lacing you up. And so that, I think, is sort of the main idea. And having to do with the idea that you were an elite person, because corsetry was associated not only with female sexual beauty, but also with elite status, because upper class people wore stiffer clothes and wore corsets for a long time before they spread to the middle and working classes. So when in the Renaissance, little boys and little girls wore corsets because their bodies were thought to be so weak. But as girls grew up and became women, theirs were the bodies that were marked as still being weak and in need of support. But this idea that the supported, tightened body was going to be an elite person's body, because a poor person's body was going to be bent and stretched out of shape, not like today so much that it would be fat, although you see that by the 19th century, but that it wouldn't be an erect, graceful, aristocratic body. And the corset was supposed to maintain that for you. So I think both of these images are showing someone who's a member of the elite, and then there's servants as well as colleagues lacing them up. This one here, those are both servants. The one there is black. The other one is probably intended to be French or Italian with the comb in his hair. He's like a friseur. So you've got all these sort of foreign people helping him look more stylish. But to be stylish is already, in the British caricature, being seen as being a little bit effeminate. This is a really fascinating thing, because if you look at literature from the early 19th century, there are quite a few references to men wearing corsets. In Thackeray's Vanity Fair, you know, that Joseph Sedley, the fat guy that she's flirting with at first, he wears a corset at the table, and he gets agitated and starts having difficulty breathing, and his father's like, cut his corset strings. Or in Cousin Bet, when Baron Hulot starts having the affair with Valerie Marneffe, he starts wearing a corset to look younger and thinner and more military. So I think that the use of having people of color is to imply, I'm the one who's the employer of all of these people. I'm of a higher social status.
Great. Thank you.
One more?
Sorry.
Okay,
No,
thank you
that's
so
right.
much.
Thank you so much.